2017, and here we are in Wittenberg, Luther City, celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, an event that was going to dramatically change all of world history. Hi, I'm Richard Weikart, Professor of History at California State University, Stanislaus. Please join me as we explore the religious dynamic of the Reformation and other religious revivals in Germany over the past several centuries, which were going to change the lives of multitudes of people, which were going to get people reading the Bible, and which were going to result in a new zeal for missions as well. Join me as we explore this exciting adventure. These revivals had a powerful impact in transforming the lives of people, introducing the Bible, and presenting a new religious dynamic that was going to dramatically change history forever. The Reformation reverberated through the subsequent centuries, spawning later revivals in Germany, two of which we will examine. We will explore the Pietist revivals of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, which included the Moravian Brethren. Finally, we will probe the awakening movement of the early 19th century, a religious revival that produced many charitable organizations. We're going to visit some of the most fascinating sites connected to these religious movements in order to answer some crucial questions. What gave rise to these movements? What impact did these revivals have on their societies? How influential are they today? And can we learn lessons from these events that will impact our lives? I hope you will find this journey educational, but also spiritually inspiring. In 1505, Luther's life took a dramatic turn here outside of Erfurt at the Luther Stone Memorial. At that time, he was confronted by a thunderstorm that made him so frightened that he called out to St. Anne asking for help. If she helped, he would become a monk. To the consternation of his father, he kept that pledge. In 1507, Luther was ordained a Catholic priest here at Erfurt Cathedral. Luther was a zealous monk, confessing his sins often and performing works of contrition and self-denial. He once commented, "If ever a monk could get into heaven through monastic discipline, I was that monk." But soon he learned the futility of trying to rely upon his works to get his salvation. After Luther came in 1511 to Wittenberg, he received his doctorate in theology and then began lecturing on the biblical books of the Psalms, Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. Over time, his biblical studies convinced him salvation was a gift from God, and Romans 1:17 became his watchword, "The just shall live by faith." This is the Castle Church door in Wittenberg, where Luther allegedly nailed up the 95 Theses on October 31st, 1517. Luther's document was responding to the crass indulgence preaching of the Dominican monk Johannes Tetzel, who told the people, "As soon as the coin in the coffer clings, a soul from purgatory springs." Purgatory was, according to Catholic teaching, a temporary place of punishment for people who weren't qualified yet to get into heaven. Luther was outraged by that preaching and rightly charged that the sale of indulgences were motivated by greed rather than compassion for souls. These indulgences had been commissioned by Leo X to help build St. Peter's Cathedral. Above these doors is a painting of Philip Melanchthon, a close friend and colleague of Luther's, who was also a professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg. He's holding in his hand the Augsburg Confession, which he wrote and which became the Lutheran Confession of Faith. Pope Leo X was enraged by Luther's challenge to the indulgences he'd authorized, so he tried to bring the German monk into submission. In October 1518, the Pope sent Cardinal Cajetan as his representative to try to convince Luther to recant. Luther traveled to Augsburg in southern Germany to meet with the cardinal. Luther and Cajetan met at the home of Jakob Fugger, one of the wealthiest men of Europe. Ironically, Fugger had been involved behind the scenes in the indulgence controversy from the start because he had loaned Archbishop Albert of Mainz a large sum of money to pay the Pope for his archbishopric. Half of the money raised by Tetzel's indulgences were flowing into Fugger's coffers. Here we are in the chapel at the Fuggerei, the oldest social establishment in the world. It opened in 1521. It's admirable, of course, that Fugger was inspired by Christian love to help the poor. However, there was another side to this charitable work. Fugger was motivated, at least in part, by a desire to reduce the time he and his family spent in purgatory. One of the requirements of living at the Fuggerei was to pray for the Fugger family 3 times daily. Jakob Fugger clearly hoped that his charitable deeds, together with the prayers he purchased along with it, would pay dividends in the afterlife for himself and his close relatives. When Luther had refused to recant his teachings about justification by faith, the Pope finally excommunicated Luther in 1520. We're here at the exhibit on our book, The Bible from Moses to the Moon. And here is a copy of the papal bull that excommunicated Luther. Luther's response was to burn the bull, so this obviously was not the copy that was sent to him.
I think Luther was a man who had studied the Bible all of his life, and as a professor of theology, that was his daily bread. And he wrestled with the Bible intellectually, emotionally, spiritually. And as he came to that discovery that of Romans 3, that it is God who justifies us by grace, that not only revolutionized his faith and his thinking, but also endeared the Bible to him even more.
This printing press here at the Luther House illustrates the way that Luther's message was to get out to the people. His Bible translations and his pamphlets were to spread far and wide throughout Germany using this new invention which came out in the late 15th century. Three central teachings of Luther that would characterize all subsequent forms of Protestantism were justification by grace alone, through faith alone, and the authority of Scripture alone. Once Luther understood salvation by faith, he had a conversion experience and said, "I felt as if I were entirely born again." In 1521, Luther was brought before the Diet of Worms to answer to Emperor Charles V, who wanted him to recant of his teachings. Luther refused, and on his way back to Wittenberg, his friendly prince, Elector Frederick the Wise, had him kidnapped and brought to this castle, where he remained incognito for about 10 months. During that time, Luther didn't waste his time, but he translated the Bible into German, which became the basis for modern High German, and gave the Bible to the common people so they could read it for themselves and see if his teachings were true.
The Bible was always held in very high esteem, but it was thought in medieval times that only the educated, only the priests, the professors could understand the Bible. Now Luther revolutionized that and said the Bible needs to go to everyone. It needs to be in the speech of people like you and me, and it needs to be touching them.
Zurich played a huge role in the Reformation under Ulrich Zwingli. This replica of the Grossmünster was created for the blind. It represents the church behind me where Zwingli led the Reformation here. He began preaching systematically from the book of Matthew and from other books of the Bible to introduce people to the truths of the Scriptures. At the Zurich City Hall, the governing authorities held disputations about Zwingli's reforms. They decided in his favor, but condemned the Anabaptists. Some reformers in Zurich didn't think that Zwingli went far enough. They were going to become the Anabaptist movement. Felix Manz, one of the early leaders, was baptized in 1525, and ultimately, a couple of years later, was going to receive what the church officials called his third baptism. That is, they drowned him in the Limmat River. Here we are in Barrettsville, Switzerland. You might even hear the cows in the background with their bells. The Anabaptists were persecuted in Switzerland in the early 16th century, so they had to meet in hiding, such as in caves or in houses underground. Here we are back in Wittenberg, the spiritual birthplace of the Reformation. With its emphasis on salvation through faith alone, the authority of Scriptures, and the priesthood of all believers, it spawned a powerful revival movement in Germany and beyond. It also was going to spawn new denominations once the Catholic Church rejected its teachings, which ultimately became the Lutheran, the Calvinist or Reformed, and the Anabaptist traditions. The spiritual vitality of the Reformation subsided thereafter. However, in the late 17th century, a new wave of revivals broke out that reacted against what some perceived as the overly formalistic, lifeless Lutheran orthodoxy. This new movement, known as the Pietist movement, profoundly influenced the Protestant world in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. What you see behind me is the Nicholas Church, the oldest church in Berlin. From 1691 to 1705, Philipp Jakob Spener was pastor here. Spener was one of the key founding fathers of the Pietist movement when he was a pastor in Frankfurt at the time. Spener, in his book Pia Desiderio, was going to call for Christian conversion experiences, calls for acts to charity, to small group Bible studies, and also devotional reading of the Bible, which was path-breaking and was going to establish the Pietist movement, which had a powerful impact not just here in Berlin, but also throughout Germany in the 1670s and thereafter. After Spener was in Berlin, he was able to get an appointment for August Hermann Franke, a protege of his, at this church here in Glaucha, which is a suburb of Halle. This is St. George's Church. About 5 years earlier, Franke, after wrestling with doubt, had experienced a powerful conversion. He described his conversion this way: "Now I experienced the truth of what Luther said in the preface to the Epistle of the Romans. Faith is a divine work in us that transforms us and gives us new birth and slays the old Adam, making us entirely new men." After ministering for over 2 decades in St. George's Church, Franke transferred here to St. Ulrich's Church in central Halle. Franke became very concerned about the poor children who were going around his neighborhood begging for bread. He began giving them religious instruction, but he wanted to offer them more. He began building this orphanage, which within a few years housed, on the average, 100 boys and 30 girls. In addition to the school and orphanage, Franke also established a publishing enterprise, a pharmacy, and a bookstore at his institution. The publishing house printed Bibles and religious literature, including many of Franke's own writings to propagate the Christian message. The first Bible Institute was set up here by Carl Friedrich von Kannstein. This publishing house, the bookstore, and the pharmacy often turned a profit, and these funds were used to finance the orphanage and schools. By the time Franke died in 1727, his institution was massive, serving over 2,900 people per day. With his zeal for missions, Franke sent out the first overseas missionaries for Protestants, including Bartholomäus Ziegenbalg. They also published Bibles in many languages. This is the Moravian Brethren Church in Herrnhut, where in the 1720s a powerful revival broke out under the auspices of Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf, at age 10, had gone to study at Franke's institution, so he was powerfully influenced by the earlier Pietist movement. While he was there, he held a Bible study and converted many of his fellow students. At age 19, Zinzendorf took a European tour, and while he was on that tour, he visited an art museum where he saw a painting of Jesus suffering. In that painting, Jesus said, "All this I have done for you. What have you done for me?" Zinzendorf was powerfully influenced by that and decided to devote his life to the service of the Lord. Zinzendorf bought this estate in Berthelsdorf in 1722. Later that same year, he met Christian David, a Moravian who was looking for refuge for Protestants who were being persecuted in Catholic Moravia. He offered them refuge here on his estate, which ultimately was going to lead to the founding of Herrnhut. Now we're at the church in Berthelsdorf near Herrnhut, where the 1727 revival caught on. A participant at one of the meetings claimed that everyone was so affected that their hearts were set on fire with new love and faith towards the Savior, and likewise with burning love toward one another.
They formed a spiritual community which really tried to live by the rules of the New Testament. And Zinzendorf was eager to find people who were sharing his vision of a real commitment to Christ and to also to mission and to build up a really Christ-centered spiritual community.
Herrnhut means the watch of the Lord, and here we are at Hutberg, which means watch hill. The Herrnhuters took this very seriously, for after the revival broke out in 1727, they began a 24-hour prayer vigil. At one time they had 77 people participating in this vigil. They would pray for their community and for missions. This prayer vigil went on for over 100 years. The Pietist movement in Germany had a huge impact on the church and society. It promoted spiritual vitality with its emphasis on the need for Christians to have a true conversion experience that would give them a personal, heartfelt relationship with God. It also led to the establishment of charitable organizations and initiated the earliest Protestant overseas missions. The Reformation in the 16th century and the Pietist revivals in the 17th and early 18th centuries brought waves of new conversions into the Christian churches, as well as a new focus on charitable activities and missions. By the end of the 18th century, however, much of that zeal had waned. In the early 19th century, a new movement called the Awakening Movement arose, beginning here in Berlin in 1816, but also spreading to other parts of Germany, bringing new fresh waves of conversions, new emphasis on charitable activities, and also new missions organizations.
The Awakening movement arose in the midst of a time of rationalism. Even though philosophical rationalism was ebbing, a form of vulgar rationalism was still being preached from the pulpits. The souls of people visiting the churches remained empty. Ludwig Harms rightly said about Schleiermacher, "The Father who begot me gave me no bread."
This is the St. Elizabeth Church in Berlin. It became a hub of the Awakening movement in the 1830s after it was built. Not coincidentally, it was named Elizabeth because the crown princess's name was Elizabeth. She was a strong proponent of the Awakening movement herself, as well as her husband, who became Frederick William IV in 1840. The first pastor here was Otto von Gerlach, who had a heart for reaching out to the working class neighborhood that was surrounding the St. Elizabeth Church. In fact, he was actually nicknamed the Wesley of Berlin because of his ability to reach out to the working class and his dynamism. The Berlin Cathedral here in the background was also an important gathering point for people in the Awakening movement. Otto von Gerlach, who had been the pastor of the Elizabeth Church before coming here in the 1840s, was able to draw many people to Christ here. His predecessor, Abraham Strauss, was also a very important proponent of the Awakening movement. If you look just over the door, there is a picture of Jesus who is saying, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And indeed, this was one of the themes of the Awakening movement, drawing people to Jesus. To the right and a little higher, there is another scripture which says, "Our faith is the victory which overcomes the world." And certainly the Awakening movement was about teaching the value of faith and a personal relationship with Jesus. The building behind me here houses the Guster Mission, which is a mission that was founded by Johannes Guster. He was a Catholic priest who was leading a revival in Bavaria in the early 19th century. Guster became a famous preacher in Berlin, drawing crowds to his church. The wife of the famous theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher is said to have preferred Guster's preaching to her husband's, and the wife of the famous philosopher Hegel also regularly attended Guster's church. Guster, like many others in the Awakening movement, was very zealous for missions. By Guster's death in 1858, his mission society had sent out 141 overseas missionaries. Like many people in the Awakening movement, Johannes Guster was very interested in reaching out to people who were poor and needy. And so in 1837, he founded this hospital behind me, which is the Elizabeth Hospital. He named the hospital after Princess Elizabeth, who was the crown princess at the time and who 3 years later became the Queen of Prussia. She was a very ardent supporter of the Awakening movement and also of charitable activities, and donated a good deal of money to the founding of this hospital. August Tolik, who was converted during the Berlin Awakening, was appointed professor here at the University of Halle in 1826. At that time, the University of Halle was a bastion of Enlightenment rationalism, and pietism was nowhere to be seen. In fact, he faced a good deal of persecution initially when he came here. However, over the years, he was going to infuse pietism into the ranks of the theology faculty, not only through his own lecturing, but also through the appointments that he influenced. While Tolik was professor at the University of Halle, in 1829 he was also named the university preacher. He preached here at the St. Ulrich's Church first. He had a powerful impact on the students through his preaching. Theodor Fliedner, who was converted during the Awakening movement, became pastor here at the Kaiserswerth Protestant City Church in 1822. Fliedner preached a message of repentance and holiness, not just in his congregation, but also in the Dusseldorf jails. In 1833, he founded an institution to help women who were being released from jail. He'd already preached in the jails for many years before that because of concern for the prisoners.
Fliedner, who founded the Deaconess Institution in 1836, was shaped by many different influences. Early in his life, he became acquainted with the Awakening movement. He took a long trip to England and the Netherlands, where he came to know Methodists and Presbyterians, Christians who were actively socially engaged. Theodor Fliedner, like Johann Heinrich Wichern, promoted the inner mission, by which he meant above all the Christianization of the Germans or Europeans. His influence was immense. He said, "We must create church structures and social structures that make it possible to live the Christian life again." Today, there are still several hundred deaconesses. Altogether, there are tens of thousands working in institutions and organizations that were influenced by Fliedner.
This is the Fliedner Institution, founded by Theodor Fliedner and his wife Friederike. They wanted to show Christian love by establishing a nursing institution where they could train young women to do acts of charity for people. They also established a Christian school and orphanage here. Fliedner's fame was eclipsed by one of the nurses who trained at his institution, Florence Nightingale, who came there in 1851 to learn to be a nurse. The hospital in Kaiserswerth, where the deaconesses train, is now called the Florence Nightingale Hospital. One of the most important communities in southwestern Germany during the Awakening movement was Korntal here. In 1819, Gottlieb Wilhelm Hoffmann founded this community as a pietist community so that people here could freely practice their faith. In addition to worshiping freely, they also established orphanages, schools, and other charitable organizations. The leading figure of the Awakening movement in Hamburg was Johann Wilhelm Rautenberg, a pastor at St. George's Church, which was at this location. It was destroyed during World War II, but today it's called the Trinity Church. Rautenberg started the first Sunday school in Germany with the help of Johann Gerhard Oncken in 1825. Oncken later was baptized in the Elbe River by an American Baptist pastor, Barnes Sears, who was studying theology under Tolik in Halle. This is Das Raue Haus, an orphanage founded by Johann Heinrich Wichern in 1833 in Hamburg. By the time the young Florence Nightingale visited Das Raue Haus in 1850, it had 70 boys, 30 girls, and about 50 staff members, including Wichern and his wife. The American church historian Philip Schaff, who visited Raue Haus in 1841, wrote, "We do not hesitate to pronounce Dr. Wichern one of the greatest and best men of the age. He stands foremost in the ranks of Christian philanthropists on the continent of Europe."
During his time as a Sunday school teacher in St. Georg, was one could say a slum of Hamburg at that time, Wichern was one of the first ones to be interested about the family, the private situation of the children. And he visited them at home and became aware of the appalling living conditions. He himself was part of the Hamburg Awakening movement, and therefore he found it as a Christian responsibility just to concerned and interested himself for the social needs people had. The Raus Haus now is a modern social institution. We have about 1,200 employees, and we do run a school, a small college, and take care of young people, handicapped people, and mentally ill people.
The Awakening movement revitalized the church, and leading figures demonstrated Christian love by establishing orphanages, hospitals, schools, and other charitable organizations. They also founded Bible societies and missions organizations to tell others about the good news of Christianity.